Hello, everyone. Welcome. Uh, this is what month is it? March edition of Dig Your Dinner. And today's topic is spilling the beans on beans. My name is Anthony Reardon. I am the Horticulture Small Farms Extension Agent for Johnson County. And let's dive right into it. So as I always plug the garden guide when we go over these, beans are also covered in the garden guide as well as on pages 135 and 136. Excellent publication for anything related to vegetable gardening. So I highly recommend that you check it out if you do not have one. Another publication that I came across as I was doing research and putting these slides together is from UMN, and it's simply called Growing Beans in Home Gardens. It's a great publication, has everything that you really kind of need to know about growing beans. But today we're going to go into kind of all the different intricacies that are, unique to beans themselves. Why beans? Why do we want to grow them? They're easy to grow. Typically, if you are growing them in the right location, you're going to have high yields. There are diverse types and varieties, lots of diverse types and varieties. Some varieties can actually fix nitrogen into the soil, which we'll get into in a bit. And they're easy to cook and store, and they're nutritious. This is obviously something Chelsea's going to go over, but beans, they are both carbs and fiber and protein and vegetables. So, it's everything under the sun is kind of encapsulated in this one piece of produce. When it comes to the types of beans that we're going to be going over, there are bush snap, whole bean, shelling, long bean, and southern peas. These are all your primary types. We're going to go into each one individually, but here's an example of kind of what they all look like. So first up is bush snap beans. When you hear the term snap beans, what they're referring to is green beans. So these are the ones you are buying in grocery stores in the cans. That's what they're originally like, but they are not always green. So if you weren't aware, they can also be purple. They can also be yellow. If they are yellow, those may be referred to as wax beans, but they're all kind of in the same family. They're all the same, species of plant that you're working with. These are short plants. They are obviously, as the name alludes to, bush beans. So they grow up to 2 feet tall and they grow wide. They do not need trellising to be supported, which is unique to bush beans themselves, because beans typically you think they're going to need to be trellised or have some kind of support there. You may need some form of like a stake there just to help the plants themselves stand up if you're in a windy area or something along those lines. But generally speaking, these are going to support themselves. The pods are tender when they are eaten. So when it comes to bush snap beans specifically, you're going to be looking for those tender pods that you're harvesting. And you need to be paying attention specifically to the size of the seeds in the pods, because these are what are going to be undesirable when you're eating bush snap beans. You can, if you do like larger seeds, let them grow for a while, but they will eventually get too large and they may not be as enjoyable as they would be otherwise. Then there are shelling beans. These are the ones that you always find dried in the stores, right? Lots and lots of different varieties. These ones are grown for the mature seeds of the beans. So you're not eating the pod itself, you're eating the seeds. The requirements for this is you need a very long growing season so that the pods can fully develop. You need dry weather for pod curing, and we'll go over pod curing in a bit. And you need an early growing season, or cool early growing season when they are first growing, because this is going to help with the blossoms setting and not dropping. Those blossoms are going to eventually turn into your pods, your fruits. So you need to be supporting them. If it gets too hot out too early, those blossoms are going to fall off. You're not going to have as much of a crop. These shelling beans include lima beans, French horticultural beans, which are those pretty purple pinkish pods that we saw earlier, pinto beans, great northern beans, and red kidney, amongst many others. Pole beans, as the name suggests, are beans that are grown on poles. These are absolutely requiring staking or trellising because they grow as a vine. They have to have something to grow on. That said, they should self-attach via the tendrils that grow there. And when you do install your poles or your trellises, they need to be installed at the time of planting, because once these plants start taking off, they're going to start growing on there immediately. It's not really something you can fix to afterwards. Keep in mind that these can grow up to 6 feet tall or taller, so you need to be looking at the variety that you're working with and how large that plant is supposed to be getting. This can entail both shelling and snap beans. So there's lots of variety again here when it comes to what you're wanting to work with. And it's a great option if you are trying to work in a compact garden, especially here in an urban area where people may not have the largest yards. This is a good option if you're still trying to get that bean crop, but you're not necessarily wanting a full bushy shrub type plants in your garden. There's also the option of long beans. These are very vigorous climbers. The vines can be up to 10 feet long. So again, absolutely requiring trellising. When it comes to long beans, these are obviously very long. They can be up to 3 feet long, which is, almost absurd. But the best, quality bean that you can get from these is when you harvest them at 12 to 18 inches. They tend to lose their quality if you allow them to grow longer than that. These are related to cowpeas, which we'll talk about in a second. And because this plant is more of a tender variety, it cannot handle temperatures that are in the 40s or below. So, where they say a hard freeze is coming, this is, even beyond a hard freeze, we don't want it to be in the 40s. So southern peas, as I had just mentioned, are related to our long beans. These entail, excuse me, they are also known as cowpeas, field peas, or black-eyed peas. Very commonly grown in the U.S. South because they very much enjoy some hot weather for that pod development. That said, they originate in Africa. They're very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant, and because of that, that makes them a very low maintenance crop. That said, again, they do not like the cool weather very much. So those temperature dips down to the 40s can damage the plants. These can be both a bush type and a vine type. So when it comes to variety selection of your beans, there's different aspects that you should be looking at. Early maturing varieties here in Kansas are going to perform better for you over late. And that is because the beans need to set again. They don't set well in the intense heats. So you want to be protecting those flower blossoms before that heat comes. Spider mites also accompany intense heat. So them being a common issue on your beans, you're going to want the early maturing variety to kind of avoid that issue. Newer cultivars and larger yields, or newer cultivars do produce larger yields. So that's something else to keep in mind. If you are working with an older cultivar, that's okay. Just know that your harvest is going to be essentially spread out. So you're going to not be harvesting as much at once, but maybe say a few handfuls every time you go out and harvest. So this is more ideal, say, if you're trying to, pick for your dinner as opposed to picking for the entire season at once. You also want to look for varieties that are resistant to bacterial blight and varieties that have heat tolerance. These are two issues that are very prominent when it comes to the quality of your bean plants. So mitigating those is going to help. Again, your southern pea type of bean actually enjoy the heat. So it's again going to come down to the type of bean that you're working with as well. And then consider the ultimate use for the crop. Are you going to be eating the beans themselves? Are you going to be eating the pods? Are you going to be eating fillets of the pods? There's different uses for all these beans, right? So you need to be considering that when it comes to the type of beans that you're planting. Speaking of planting, there's lots of considerations to take or keep in mind. You want to sow your seeds in May because the soil temperatures need to be 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you can, for a fall crop, plant again in July, but you're going to have those issues where it comes to heat that may be mitigating blossom developments, that may be, instigating spider mites. Bloom timing, again, is very critical. You are going to have poor quality plants essentially and poor quality crop if it's too hot while those blooms are developing. So you need to time out when you plant that to have those blooms essentially being developed during cooler weather. Sow the seeds an inch deep. For pole beans, you're going to want to space them 6 inches to a foot apart, and then bush beans 2 to 4 feet or 2 to 4 inches apart. Actually, I believe that's 2 to 4 feet. I don't know why I said inches. Okay. And then crop rotation. It is going to be the legume Fabaceae family that you're looking at. So anything that is, obviously beans, but also peas, soybeans, anything within that family is what you're going to want to be moving around, because you do have several issues that can potentially produce when it comes to your plants. Spider mites, bean leaf beetle, bacterial leaf blight, and anthracnose are four of the main ones. Not all of those are, things that can be mitigated by crop rotation, but some of them are. When it comes to plant care, you do not want to soak your beans before planting them. Typically, when you have seeds this large, that's something that people would consider as, oh, I should soak the seeds first so that I get adequate germination. If you soak your beans, they're going to become too mushy and they're essentially going to rot in the soil. So don't do that. Moisten the soil for germination, but also do not create a crust. When you create a crust, it's going to create an oxygen deprived soil, which is not going to be good for root development. Be careful cultivating. So when we cultivate, we are doing that to keep any of the weeds or plants that we don't want growing there out of the garden, right? But beans do have a shallow root system. So if you're not being careful while you're cultivating, you could be damaging the roots to the plants that you do want there. Provide good quality weed control. Water during dry periods, because this is a plant that prefers a moist soil. Avoid salty soil locations. Beans are particularly inept to be damaged by salty soil. So if you say have a sidewalk that frequently gets salt applied to it during the winter, growing beans right next to that sidewalk may not be the best option. Also, beans are very highly prone to herbicide drift damage. So if you are next to a farm or say a place that commonly sprays, it may not be the best location to be planting beans. Over fertilization can also result in delayed flowering for beans because of too much nitrogen, and it can also just produce, a very leafy plant that essentially just doesn't produce much fruits itself. So that's something to be wary of. The plants do not need a lot of nutrients in the soil. They like a moderate amount. So then there is the harvest question. And this comes down to drying beans, right? So are you trying to produce fresh beans or are you trying to produce stored beans? Fresh beans, you're going to harvest these when the beans are thin and tough, but not dry yet. And stored, they need to be harvested when the pods are fully dry and the beads inside of the pods themselves rattle. Other considerations to take in mind, bacterial blight is very common on beans, and this can be spread through the dew that's essentially forms on the leaves of the plants in the morning. So you do not want to be harvesting beans in the morning because that dew can move that disease around. Lima and horticultural beans, where you're eating the seed itself, you want to harvest when the pods are fully formed and the seeds are a desirable size. So essentially, let those grow to their max size and to the fullest of their extent. When it comes to curing shelling beans, this is a question I get often on beans because a lot of people like to grow them and then, save them for later. Dry weather is going to be your best friend. It is the most critical part of essentially curing them because you're going to leave them on the plants until the pods themselves dry out and you're hearing the beans rattle inside of those pods. Then you can shell them and open them up and get your crop out of it. That said, if we have a particularly wet growing season, or if the plant is growing into the fall where it's cool and wet weather, you can use a different method where you essentially pull up the entire plant, especially bush beans. This would be easier to deal with. Shake the soil loose, then you hang the plant up upside down inside, and you allow it to dry out that way. Then you can pull your pods off that are dry and harvest them. when you are working with bulk pods, it can be a bit tedious to, individually shell every single pod. So what you can do is put it into like a gunny sack or like a burlap sack of something along those lines, and literally take a stick and kind of beat the sack with it. It's going to break up those pods. The beans themselves are going to fall out, and then you can pull the extra leafy material out of there. You may have some papery, filmy type material in there as well. So there's a technique where you can spread what you have broken apart onto a tarp outside, and that papery material will actually be caught in the wind and kind of blow away from your crop. And then you can just pick up the beans because that's all that would be remaining. Now, when it comes to nitrogen in beans, you may have heard that nitrogen is fixed into the soil by beans. And this is true with some legumes, but it's not true with all of them. So it's going to depend on the type of crop that you're working with. If it does, then adding nitrogen to the soil for the plant is not going to really be necessary because it's providing its own nitrogen. But again, too much soil nitrogen decreases crop yields in beans. So you definitely want to be wary of how much you are adding to your soil. Then something fun I wanted to point out while I was looking at all of the different things that we can, or different types of beans that are out there. There's actually a South American bean tree that is called the ice cream bean tree. And it is called this because the pulp around the bean tastes like vanilla ice cream. It is tropical plants. It does not grow here, but I just found that really interesting. And of course, the one vegetable that exists that tastes like ice cream, we can't have and don't have access to. But that said, I will open it up for questions real quick, and we will go over to Chelsea. All right. It's all yours, Chelsea. Here, let me stop sharing. How much sun is needed for bush beans? Typically bush beans are going to need full sun. All of your vegetables are going to need full sun. You can get by growing them in partial shades, so 4 to 5 hours of direct sun a day. That said, you need to anticipate having less of a developed crop than you would if you had full sun.
Okay, I'm now going to talk about the nutrition and all the things that is important when we talk about eating beans. As Anthony mentioned, they are very nutritious and super rich for us. So we're going to talk about all the different benefits. Snap beans are found to be a good source of some B vitamins, specifically our folate, and we have calcium, iron, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, copper. They do have phytonutrients, which are like our antioxidants, vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin K, as I mentioned, folate and manganese. So our snap beans are our green ones, and they're typically consumed fresh. Depending on how you consume them, some of these nutrients are lost during the heating process. So just being cautious of that, eating them fresh, or if you do cook them, you want to cook them for a short amount of time, because the longer you cook them, the longer your vitamin C and other nutrients are lost. So fresh legumes, or excuse me, fresh beans are not legumes. So they're technically not a bean, despite the name. Other legumes that we can think of are our soybeans, peanuts, and fresh peas. They come in a variety of colors. As Anthony mentioned, we have our green, yellow, and purple. Fresh beans do have little protein compared to our dried shelling beans, little protein and little fiber. They still are really rich for us, and they have a lot of nutrients, but they don't have as much fiber and protein as our dried shelling beans. So when we say green beans and beans, they are different, specifically when it comes to that nutrition piece. For example, 2 grams of protein per 100 grams of green beans versus almost 25 grams of protein per 100 grams of dried black beans. You can see there's a significant difference there. I'm trying to hide my screen there. Okay, so purchasing and storing. The fresh, you do want to use them within about 3 to 5 days. They can go bad and they're highly perishable, so you want to use them best. If you're not going to use them within those 3 to 5 days, you will notice they tend to start to get a little wilty. They maybe aren't quite as crisp. So you'll want to then either preserve them or use them right away. So you can purchase frozen green beans from the store. Of course, we want to watch for those that have added sauces and added ingredients in our store bought. It is best to just buy the plain green beans that are flash frozen and use those for your meals. You can always add your own sauce and your own seasoning. It's just when you buy it purchased like that from the store, there is going to be more sodium, more sugar, those types of added ingredients that you will typically add less of yourself at home. And then of canned, we want to make sure that we are watching that sodium for those in-store bought purchases. You can choose no sodium or low sodium options. And if those aren't available, just give those green beans a good rinse under some cool running water to help get off some of that extra sodium. As Anthony mentioned, there is yellow and purple varieties. The purple color comes from a pigment known as anthocyanin, which is an antioxidant. However, even though they're purple, they don't stay purple. So cooking does degrade that anthocyanin, and it causes the color to return to a green. So you can preserve their beautiful purple shade and the highest level of nutrients by enjoying it raw or as a snack or in salads. I personally haven't tried this yet, but you probably could also do just a very quick cook with some olive oil in a skillet just to warm them, but you would not want to cook them for a significant period of time because they will return to that green shade as well. Same with if you're trying to can our purple beans, they won't be canned and remain purple because of that cooking process. Our yellow wax beans, they are very rich in vitamin C, vitamin A, and vitamin K compared to some of the other varieties, especially the green beans. So incorporating them, there's a lot of different ways you incorporate your snap beans into your diet, adding to stir fry, adding to different soups, sauteing, grilling, roasting. I personally love green beans in the air fryer to give it a good kind of air fried roast, eating raw in a salad, and of course, steaming. As I mentioned, we want to make sure that we are cooking to a minimum time. I personally don't like soggy green beans and squishy green beans. So to keep that nice crisp texture, you want to make sure that you are reducing your cook time. So preserving the green beans, there are a few different options. Probably the most common is our freezing. You do want to make sure that you are blanching these green beans first, which a blanch is about 3 minutes in boiling water, and that stops the enzymes from degrading the green beans during the storage period. Then you'll want to freeze them in a single layer on a cookie sheet. I like doing this with most of my vegetables and fruit because then you don't get them stored in a big clump. And so when you're ready to use them, they're already kind of separated out and you have them just nicely individualized. You want to then transfer them to a freezer safe container or baggie of your choice and try to get out as much air as possible. For longer storage life, you can also then do a freezer bag that takes the oxygen out so you can kind of go through that process, but it is not necessarily, you can use any type of freezer safe container or baggie. And then of course we have our home canning. It is a low acid vegetable, so we must pressure can our green beans. Green beans was one of those that was pretty common back in the olden days to just water bath can. And maybe you have grandparents, people that you knew that water bath. And to this day, some people still water bath their green beans. But it is a low acid vegetable, so we must pressure can it. You're only to use pint or quart jars. There's really no safe processing method determined for those larger jars. And as a gauge about how much you'll need, it takes about 2 pounds of green beans per quart jar or 1 pound per pint jar. And you may raw or hot pack. And so basically what this means is you can either go ahead and put the beans in a boiling pot of water and use that hot water when you pack them in, or you can pack the raw beans directly in the can and then fill the water on top of it. And then there is a pickled option. If you've never had pickled green beans, I recommend trying it. It's just a really nice different take to a pickled type of vegetable. Pickled green beans and pickled carrots are some of my kind of favorite pickled vegetables right now that I'm liking. You do want to make sure that you're following a tested recipe. So the National Center for Home Food Preservation does have a dilled bean recipe that is pretty good. You want to make sure that you're not altering your vinegar or ingredients or the amounts, because that will change the acidity level. And one important thing is that you want to make sure that you're checking your vinegar. You want to make sure you have one that is 5%. You do need to check because they do fool you. Sometimes you can get some that say 4%, and that 1% does make a big difference. So some places it's on the front, some places it's on the back ingredient label. You just kind of got to look on whatever vinegar you are using and double check that it says 5 and not 4%. You can water bath for this method, specifically because we are using an acid. So you don't need to do the pressure canning like you would if you were just doing the straight vegetables, the straight green beans as a vegetable with no acid. So our beans are rich in plant protein, fiber, B vitamins, iron, folate, calcium. These are our shelling beans. As I mentioned, they have higher plant protein and fiber. So shelling beans really are a nutrition powerhouse. A lot of studies have shown that eating an average of about 3/4 cup of cooked common shelled beans, specifically those that are navy beans, red beans, pinto beans, black beans, eating 3/4 cup every day over a range of about 4 to 8 weeks decrease LDL cholesterol, which is our bad cholesterol, by about 19% in the participants of this specific study. There's been numerous studies that have looked at weight management, cholesterol, diabetes, all of these chronic diseases, and beans. Consuming cooked dried beans, such as pinto and red beans, was associated with an 11% lower rate of cardiovascular disease. 1 cup of cooked beans contains, on average, about 15 grams of protein, but that does vary by the varieties, and we'll show that here in the next coming slide. And then same, 1 cup of cooked beans contains about 10 to 15 grams of fiber, but it does vary by variety. So here's kind of a table of some of those things that I was just talking about. Specifically for this table, I want you to look at the last 2 columns, which is fiber and protein. This chart is for a 1/2 cup, which is generally the recommended serving size, but eating a cup definitely gives you more bang for your buck, especially if you're using it as your main protein source. So looking at this, we can see that navy beans actually have the highest amount of fiber at about 9.6. So if you eat a cup of navy beans, you are getting nearly 19 grams of, or a little over 19 grams of fiber. And the recommended intake of fiber is about 21 to 35 grams of fiber, depending on if you're male or female and your age. So eating 1 cup of navy beans will really help to knock out your fiber intake for the day. As for the protein, it has decent protein at 7.5. You can see most of them are kind of in that 7.5 range. And then the cranberry bean actually has the highest protein of those listed here on this. When we talk about nutrients, you know, they're really all pretty much about the same in terms of the amount that they offer. You can see here that, for example, if you're concerned with your calcium, a black bean has the lower calcium of those listed, where a navy bean and Great Northern have the highest calcium. If we're talking about iron, same thing. Our red kidney beans have about the highest for that. So, you know, depending on what your nutrition needs are, but this just kind of shows that there really is pretty common similarities among those varieties with minor differences. So purchasing, you can purchase, you know, you can do your fresh shelling beans. If we think about our lima beans specifically, that's probably the most common fresh bean that we can think of. They're similar to dried nutritionally. You really want to use them within those 1 to 3 days though, because they do go bad. And so you store them. The nice thing about these is you don't need to pre-soak them like you do with your dried ones, and you can just simmer them in a liquid to cook. So they're usually used in kind of a soup of some sort. You don't want to add salt during the cooking process, as this can toughen up the skin of those fresh beans. And again, the canned, same thing. You just want to watch for that added sodium in those store-bought options. Dry is really the most economical. If we think about the cost compared to a can of black beans is anywhere from $1 to maybe $2, depending on the brand, where you can get a huge bag of dried beans for just a couple bucks often. They do require soaking and do take longer to cook. So that's usually the drawback of why people prefer to do a canned bean versus a dried bean. You can use a slow cooker or a pressure cooker to cook these beans. However, the one bean that you do not want to use a slow cooker is the red kidney bean. You want to make sure that you boil this first and then go ahead and cook that like you normally would in your slow cooker, but you're going to add it once it's already been basically boiled for about 30 minutes. If the cannellini beans, you want to soak those overnight as well and go ahead and boil them. Dry beans have a very long storage life, especially when stored properly. So that's the benefit of these as well, is that they can last a really long time.
Oh, I handed you a stack of things the other night and said, put these in the garage.
Let me, yeah, somebody is talking, and just make sure that everybody is muted. Awesome, thank you. So then moving on, one of the other drawbacks around why people don't like to consume beans, even though they're rich in protein, rich in fiber, is because they give people gas. That is the number one complaint I hear is I like beans, but they cause my stomach to not be happy and they give me gas. So here's just a couple tips on how we can reduce kind of that side effect. So beans do contain a compound called raffinose, and it's a type of non-digestible carbohydrate, which is why it gives us gas, because our body can't fully digest it. This is also found in foods like our cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. So you may have similar experiences where you get gas after you eat those other vegetables, and that's because of that non-digested carbohydrate. Some people tend to lack. We have an enzyme that helps us digest those, and some people lack that enzyme, so that's why it affects people differently. Black beans are actually one of those that tend to cause gas for the majority, for most people. They have the highest level of that raffinose, which has the greatest effect. So some other tips is, you can soak your beans a little bit longer. So instead of just soaking them overnight, soak them for about 48 hours. You want to switch out that water so that those compounds that are dissolving into that water are tossed out. You'll then want to cook them until very soft and keep them fully covered with water while boiling. Of course, chewing, one of the biggest reasons is we need to chew our food, right? We need to fully chew our food to help with the digestion. If we are snarfing our food down and eating really, really quickly and not chewing our food well, then that increases the risk of us having digestion issues and having the side effect of gas. Adding beans slowly, they are really high in fiber, so you want to increase them gradually into your diet. If you're not used to eating beans and you start eating a cup of beans a day, your stomach and digestion will not be very happy, but maybe you start with eating a quarter cup or half a cup and gradually increase over time. You can add some of these other things to it that just help with digestion. Ginger and cumin are those that are most commonly available in our grocery stores, and they can help with digestion as well. You want to add salt late in the cooking process, not early. A lot of people tend to salt early thinking that it's helpful, but you actually want to add that salt later in the cooking process. And then your canned beans, you can rinse them, but you can further cook them as well. So you can cook your canned beans to digest and soften them a little bit more. So preserving your shelling beans, you can freeze your beans. So let's say you cook a big bag Oh, I just realized that I have the wrong little bullet point there, but it's still the same process. You'll cook your shelling beans, and you can either freeze them in a single layer so that the beans aren't all frozen together, or some people will also freeze it in the cooking liquid, and either way is okay. You want to leave a 1/2 inch of the headspace to allow for that expansion to happen. Same, it is a low acid vegetable. You can pressure can your shelling beans. You want to use only the pint jars. Again, same thing, no safe processing method for those larger jars. And for this, it's about 1.5 pounds of dried shelled beans per quart and about 0.75 pounds per pint. You do want to make sure you're soaking and boiling your beans for about 30 minutes prior to putting them in your jars. And of course, you can also then can it with a tomato sauce or molasses sauce for your baked beans. So your southern peas, don't be fooled by the name. It's not a pea, it's a bean. They are just as nutritious. They have a lot of fiber and protein. They have a lot of folate, and they are high in polyphenols. The tradition is in the Southern cultures is to eat black-eyed peas on New Year's Day for good luck and prosperity in the year ahead. So even though we are in March, maybe you start to plan that you'll start to incorporate some of those black-eyed peas starting in the new year for your diet. It's coming out of cold season, but winter likes to mess with us. So maybe on a chilly day like we've been having, you want to have one last run at some chili. So here is a turkey chili recipe with sweet potatoes and black beans. This is a very interesting dish. And what I really like about it is you get all the flavors of kind of the chili, but I really like that the sweet potatoes add just a touch of sweetness to the dish without it being too sweet. And then, of course, those black beans. You could certainly substitute any type of bean that you like in this dish. But the sweet potatoes do add a nice little feature. So I would recommend that you try this, especially if you are a fan of sweet potatoes. This is a great little take on it. If you don't have ground turkey, you could certainly use ground beef as well. And, we have all of our store-bought baked beans, which are good, but there's something about making your own baked beans as well. So here's a slow cooker recipe. You could use any type of dried bean that you like, whether it's a navy or a Great Northern. We have some onion, we have brown sugar, molasses, and some seasonings and spices. So this is a great thing. You just kind of mix it all together, add it to the slow cooker, and then you cook on low or high. It's a great dish, especially, you can get rid of some of those added preservatives that are in your traditional, and we can always control the sugar. So maybe that you find that 4th cup of each of the brown sugar and molasses is a little too sweet for you and you want a little bit less sweet, go ahead and reduce that sugar down. And then there's something about lemon with our green beans or even on our leafy greens. I just love a splash of lemon on my vegetables. It really brightens up the flavor. And so we talked about the fresh green beans before and really just sauteing them in a pan with some oil. You add a little bit of heat with your crushed red pepper flakes and then some garlic and just, a little squeeze of a lemon really makes those flavors pop. And it's just so delicious. So with that is kind of the end of my nutrition slides. Are there any questions on any of that material or anything from Anthony's? What about adding baking soda to dry beans? There's really not recommendations to add baking soda to dry beans. It will change the texture. Most of the time when you add baking soda to any type of vegetable, it tends to change the texture. I would say that's a dated practice that a lot of, that's very common, I would say, in the older days. And I lived in Africa for a period of time and they still put kind of a baking soda in their vegetables, but it does make them quite soft and isn't really recommended for cooking these days. And then I see Raina had mentioned that she made one of the recipes, so that's good.
There's a question here about grasshoppers being one of the worst bean pests that they have. If you have chickens, which I believe this person does, that is your main go-to. And unfortunately, that's our best recommendation we can give for that. There are some pesticides or insecticides out there that you can treat grasshoppers with. That said, the best way to go about doing that is to hit the periphery of your garden area. Where they're entering. And then you need to remember that it's not just one age or instar of the grasshoppers that you're treating. It's the grasshoppers and their babies and their babies and their babies. So you're going to have to be hitting it at several times essentially with that insecticide to be hitting the correct instar, the correct age of grasshoppers to treat for those. Grasshoppers, they have a very thick exoskeleton, which makes it very hard and difficult for them to be treated, but that is the best recommendation that I can give. When you are using those pesticides, probably going to be your harsher chemicals that treat them. So definitely treat early in the morning or late in the evening when your pollinators are not as active.
Great questions. Are there any others? Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today for this webinar. We have recorded it, so this recording will be available for those who are able to attend today, or if you want to go back and listen to any of the previous things that we've shared with you today. And then stay tuned for next month, Dig Your Dinner. Thanks, Nancy. Bye, everyone.